Hey everyone, welcome back to Engineer Empire. I'm a software engineer turned corporate VP and head of technology. I dive into topics like engineering, finance, and business. If that interests you, please hit like or subscribe. Today I'm reacting to why making it feels impossible in the US now.
This is a mock monthly household budget for an American family in 1985. If we compare that to a hypothetical budget in 2022, we can see that most expenses scaled with inflation, with a few exceptions. Rent, out-of-pocket healthcare costs, and childcare are notably.
Gonna pause here, especially because this is such a useful chart that they have. Obviously, inflation is going to be a portion of what is driving this feeling. I think overall, I think this is something most Americans are feeling at the moment between the cost of living increase, inflation, a variety of topics, and also how soft the job market has become. I think I've heard some surveys, things like that, pointing to people having the lowest confidence in the job market now as basically similar to the pandemic time. And so that's pretty bad. That basically means people are not very confident they can get a job or get a new job if they needed one. And so I think those things are all kind of factoring up where people are frightened of whether they're going to be able to make ends meet. And also, like, if they're kind of just like one paycheck away from kind of falling behind or getting into trouble, on top of inflation obviously being a very bad combination.
More expensive in 2022, even when accounting for inflation. And costs associated with retirement increased by more than 60%. But these numbers are not accounting for a big X factor: consumer debt, such as credit cards and student loans. Total outstanding consumer credit was nearly $600 billion in December 1985. By 2022, it was nearly $4.9 trillion.
That makes sense. So they're basically saying, even though it looks not too bad from just inflation and cost of living purposes, the amount of debt that we have in combination is making it a very different picture with that behind the scenes. I would also expect there to be just generally more people in the US between this time frame. So hopefully they'll break this down by per person, but I would not have expected it to have increased this much just based off of like population growth. This is clearly, consumer debt is growing in and of itself.
Debt has been rising over time. Student loans weren't really a thing for baby boomers.
Millennials have larger student loan balances, bigger mortgages, much bigger car payments than their parents did a generation ago. In addition to more expensive childcare costs, higher prices pretty much across the board. So that does make it more difficult to set extra money aside or make any long-term plans.
We're living in two separate economies. The American dream that was pitched to the Gen Xers and the Boomers is no longer present in today's world.
A lot of people, particularly the working class and the part of the middle class, don't think their children will be as well off as they were. That's a problem.
Many people live in what I describe as at break even. Over the course of the year, they might make enough money to pay for basic living expenses and cover their bills. But if one major thing happens, then they can get behind.
Here's why young American adults are struggling to make ends meet and what can be done. Millennials' net worth quadrupled from $3.9 trillion to nearly $16 trillion between.
Wow, that is quite a bit of growth. And that's just for the millennial segment, which I think is definitely becoming a more prominent segment of the market. Obviously, these would be folks presumably in their 30s or 40s, I believe, at this point. And so this is kind of where people are entering their peak earning years. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 40 to 50 is peak earning for most folks in their careers. So this is where certainly millennials are no longer the newcomer to the marketplace. This is obviously Gen Z now. I'm seeing a lot more hype around Gen Z entering the market and how to handle interacting with those folks. Same thing happened for millennials when we entered the market. And there was all this, how do you deal with a millennial and working? And now we're sort of progressing into, we're sort of the core job market right now, where we're young enough that we're still going to be in the market for quite some time, but we're old enough that we're not entry level anymore. We're starting to take on more and more prominent roles and progressing in our careers. So us having a noticeable growth in wealth does make sense, especially because I would expect the earlier portion of this time frame millennials still had a lot of debt at this point coming out of school. And so 5 years can be a big difference for whether you've kind of completed all of your student loan debt or made a serious dent in that debt and then start to actually accumulate wealth. So it's hard to put these numbers into perspective because they're measuring these in like trillions. But I think that's where if you have hundreds of millions of people who are in this bucket, obviously small numbers can add up.
2019 and 2024, but more than half report living paycheck to paycheck.
A lot in this group have benefited from a strong jobs market and rising wages. And during the pandemic, many people bought a home. That made a lot of people wealthier, but more on paper. The disconnect between being rich on paper and feeling well off has been referred to as phantom wealth. Your net worth has gotten greater, but
That's interesting. I've never heard phantom wealth before as a phrase, but it makes sense. Again, this is where, for instance, if we take student loans as an example, you might still be progressing, especially as you get towards the end of a large debt segment like that. Every payment more is going to principal than interest. So like you're probably taking larger and larger chunks. But like if you still have 1 to 5 years on this debt that you had back in the day, you're still probably feeling like you're paycheck to paycheck, even though you're probably just about to take the turn on it. And especially if we include houses as part of that, obviously you get the asset itself and housing prices increase quite a bit. So if a good portion of millennials are owning homes, between 2019 to 2025, obviously everyone knows home prices skyrocketed in America. I think easily like 20, 30, 40% potentially in some markets. And so if you bought a home at a reasonable price then, and then it increased by those types of percentages, obviously that's a huge amount of wealth, even though you might not necessarily feel it yourself at that point.
you're not feeling richer necessarily.
It's taking young adults longer than their parents to meet some milestones, such as living on their own, buying property, and starting a family.
It's a lot harder for young people today to save up for markers of the American dream than it was for previous generations. When we look at home buying, as we all know, we're in historically tight housing markets. There are very few homes on the market, and those that are on the market are extremely expensive, not to mention expensive mortgage rates. And the prices of homes has escalated over the last few decades much faster than actual incomes. So it is actually much harder for a millennial or a Gen Z to save up for a down payment to buy a home.
It's not the overspending, it's the cost of living.
I think the middle class, unfortunately, is dead for millennials and Gen Zers, or best case scenario, the goalpost has just moved and it's still obtainable, but you have to make over 6 figures to have that middle class life. But people who are older were in a better economic time growing up, because the big difference is what I call the big three. Millennials and Gen Zers are faced with outrageous housing prices, whether it's rent or owning, massive monthly college student loan debt payments, and daycare.
Freddie Smith made a career shift from actor to realtor and started making content about the state of the housing market.
In the summer of 2023, I was maybe one of the first or the handful that was able to say, hey, the housing prices hit 420, the interest rates hit 7%. You now need $120,000 to qualify for a home. And it went viral. And then it just bled into people asking comments and me making more videos. Then it got into the boomer versus millennial debate, and it just kind of continued to grow from there, and it took its own shape. I had to rebuild my life in my early 30s, so I'm really relating to the 22-year-olds who are building their life, and it's a totally different economy than when I built mine when I was 19.
Not being able to save for a home has big retirement implications for millennials and Gen Z.
Those who don't own homes, now those are people who are in real trouble. They're trying to save to get their own place. They're paying high rent somewhere. They're commuting a long distance or trying to work at home so they can save on childcare or so they can save just on housing costs. Those living patterns are increasingly what's happening for younger workers.
In the 1980s, the typical first-time homebuyer was in their late 20s. With a 30-year mortgage, that would mean they owned their home outright by the time they retired in their 60s, providing them with a better chance at sticking to a fixed income in their retirement. A national housing shortage, high rent prices, and competition from wealthier buyers are all making it harder for young adults to buy their first home. In 2024, the median first-time homebuyer was 38 years old, an all-time.
Wow, 38 is definitely getting up there. Obviously, boomers, I'm pretty sure it was low 30s, maybe even high 20s. Feel free to fact check me if anyone has those exact numbers. But certainly it would be lower than this. Obviously, inherently, if this is an all-time high, everything else was lower. And so it'll be interesting to see if this shifts at all for like Gen Z or beyond. Is it just going to kind of keep ticking up to the point where like Gen Zers are averaging first-time home buyers in their 40s, or is it going to start to kind of turn things around and maybe get younger and more affordable for them?
High.
You have a lot of people 25 to 34 who are looking to start a family and cannot find a home for their families. Maybe the homes aren't where they want them to be inside the city, but even outside a city, it's been very difficult for young families to find a place.
So I think it's healthy for us to try to find different ways that maybe home ownership doesn't have to be the symbol of the American dream. But then to counter that, on my own point, I encourage those who can afford homes to buy it, because once it's paid off, you're going to have a more comfortable retirement.
So I sort of agree with what he's saying here. I think he's covering a couple things, and I want to make sure folks just don't go kind of off the rails necessarily with this type of advice. So I think he first started off by saying like he does encourage folks to buy something even if it's kind of out of the way. And that I 100% agree with. That's what I got started with. I started way outside of the city. Like it was closer to be across state lines. If you were in somewhat better position than I was, where I was working, and nobody was jealous of me in my commute, but it really helped me get set up early on with having a very cheap mortgage, very affordable place. It was super inconvenient, but it allowed me to kind of have a few years there and kind of set a foundation and then kind of work off of that foundation in the future. So I do recommend that component for sure, because you can take your time and progress. I think he sort of progresses into the second statement of like, if you can and you're able to buy a home, do it. I think this is a little bit iffier for me, in so much as some things people don't realize is, one, depending on the type of home, especially if you have like a single family home, you're responsible for a lot of the maintenance and expenses that go into it. So like, for instance, you could have an issue with your roof or your water pipe or heating or some variation of those or anything else. And like that could cost you tens of thousands of dollars potentially. And I believe most Americans, I think 50-ish%, don't have like $1,000 in case of emergency. So dealing with like a multi $10,000 issue for your home could set you potentially far back compared to what you would be if you either just purchased something that was kind of within your means or renting. So I wouldn't necessarily jump to it. I think he does make another good point, which is it sets you up well for retirement. And I think this is true, which is where some people refer to this as like sort of a forced savings plan. But effectively, if you go into a mortgage and you have hopefully a fixed rate, ideally, you can always refinance if rates go lower in the future. You're paying down this mortgage over 30 years. So like, let's take the average example of 38. If you buy a home at 38, when you are 68 years old, your mortgage is going to be paid for. And then boom, you just have less payments and less expenses. So that's still a little high, because obviously like standard retirement age is about 65. And so ideally you could shrink it a little bit more over the course of that time, maybe make a couple extra payments at some point, but you're still going to be pretty close where either just around retirement or maybe just after retirement age, your home would be paid for and your expenses would drop. You would get Social Security. And so basically your expenses drop, you get extra income. And if you've been saving and doing everything else, like it will make retirement much easier compared to somebody who's renting their entire life. It doesn't mean that you can't do that or you shouldn't do that. You should double check your own finances. And it's also possible to retire perfectly safely just with a rental for your entire life. There's nothing saying you have to have a home. There are other vehicles like the stock market or especially index funds that you can have faster and better growth for your money than necessarily in a home that you live in and have to maintain. So I would just caution folks here, don't just buy the biggest, nicest house you can just because he said so or someone you know said so, or because like your loan rep says you can afford something that's outrageously priced and that you're maybe just barely going to make ends meet for the mortgage payment, because there's extra expenses on top of that. And you could really go underwater from there, end up losing the house, maybe even lose a bunch of money in that. So I wouldn't recommend folks just chasing whatever is possible,
because you're not going to be subject to the ever-increasing rent prices.
Many Americans are navigating a new kind of economic instability, which traditional financial advice may not prepare them for. Rachel Schneider co-authored the book The Financial Diaries with NYU professor Jonathan Mordock. They spent a year tracking the granular spending habits of 235 families.
What we saw was a huge amount of volatility. That was our core finding. The majority of Americans work hourly jobs. And so for them, the amount of money that they earn fluctuates week by week. I get 30 hours this week versus 45 hours next week. And so as a result, income is really up and down over the course of a month. And that flies in the face of all of the budgeting advice we usually give people.
There's a difference between surviving and thriving. And I just think if we're going to claim that we're the richest country, the best country in the world, why isn't everyone who's working 40 hours, 50 hours a week thriving? How is that possible?
On top of income instability, cost of living is increasingly unstable.
Tariffs have added a lot of uncertainty into future economic conditions. We don't really know how this is going to play out just yet. And if people start to feel nervous about what...
So tariffs definitely did add a lot of uncertainty. I think they are still talking about tariffs, but generally speaking, I don't think there's been as large of a surge as people were anticipating or fearful of. So I think, to at least some credit to what's actually happening, it's not like suddenly prices jumped like 20-25% like people had feared when the tariffs potentially took effect. Obviously, some are postponed, some are delayed, etc. But it seems like just general inflation still cooling down is still basically what's happening. It isn't in line with where people want it to be, but it isn't like we just had another 10, 15, 20, 25% surge in inflation in 2025. Still, it theoretically could happen, but I remember this being hyped a lot at the beginning of the year. And now that we're getting towards the later portion of the year in 2025, it obviously didn't happen. We'll see how it progresses, but it does add uncertainty for sure.
what lies ahead, then they may dial back on things like consumer spending.
The tariffs are creating uncertainty for those people. They don't know what to do. Businesses aren't hiring more people. They're just waiting to see they have a stable business environment they can go. Without stability, they can't.
I think this is a much better point than necessarily like inflation or cost of living price increasing from tariffs. I think this part is potentially something we are seeing right now, which is the job market is obviously softer than it has been. And tariffs are a much larger portion for business owners, which is if you're buying and selling goods and you're not sure how much of a profit you're going to make on those, then you have to be a little bit more cautious. Maybe you're not giving people as many raises as you would have in a normal year. Maybe you're not buying as much inventory all at once, or maybe you're buying extra and you don't have as much cash lying around. Maybe you're not hiring or anticipating growth. And so I think this is something we are seeing in the job market today. And this could be an impact of tariffs, again, because from the business side, you're trying to project out, like if you're hiring somebody, you ideally as a business owner know you can pay that person's salary for the next year, 2 years, maybe 5 years. And so you are trying to put yourself in the shoes of yourself in 6, 12, 48 months, whatever it is. And so if you're not sure about tariffs, that could be a huge difference. If you're saying, okay, a tariff right now is 15%, but it could be 25%, that could make or break hiring 1 or 2 extra people for your even a small business. And so that could be happening at this point in time, certainly much more so than the impacts of tariffs on inflation itself.
At the same time, the tariffs are going to create a big sales tax on lower income people who spend more on the basics, which are going to go up. And so that's going to create problems for them too.
What the historians tell us that every single new generation gets complaints from the older generation about how they're behaving irresponsibly, immorally, blaming millennials for spending too much on avocado toast.
It's not student loans or a tough job market keeping millennials from buying homes. It's reportedly avocado toast.
I appreciate that they mentioned this here. I think a lot of what I'm seeing now being referenced for like Gen Z is exactly what they said about millennials back in the day, like a decade ago, and millennials don't want to work. They don't work that hard. They're making frivolous purchases, whatever it is. This is the exact same thing older generations were saying about us. And so if you're a Gen Z, don't feel that bad about it. It just seems to be like a rite of passage, it appears, when you enter adulthood. Basically, all the older generations are like, they just don't understand. They're not as good as we are. And I think some of it is fair. Obviously, I'm sure for many millennials, now that you've been in the workforce for maybe a decade or more, you're probably a little bit more jaded about most things than you were when you were just right out of college, hopeful, expectant about your career, especially hitting inflation and a pandemic. You're probably in a different position now, and especially with the job market being tougher, that means probably people are working much harder right now, or maybe they've already made it through a few layoffs or a few cuts here and there. And so they have a very different perspective of the workforce than other folks, and also of their spending, which would be different for obviously somebody who's right out of college, goes from making maybe barely any money or no money to making tens of thousands of dollars. Like, that's a huge jump for folks who are in those shoes. Like, at least from my own experience, like going from broke college kid to like actually having a job post college was the biggest jump in wealth that I had. And it was like raining money, even though it wasn't that much at that time and in hindsight. But like going from, making like 10,000 a year to making like 50,000 a year is a huge difference. And you can feel that difference, and spending $5 on a coffee or avocado toast doesn't feel frivolous compared to where you were at those points. So we'll see how we report on this in the future.
The one piece of advice for young people out there who are spending their money on avocado toast and don't have any goals, what would you say to them?
I would say to them, get as much pleasure out of saving as you do spending.
This kind of advice is usually framed as a warning against lifestyle creep, which is the idea that as people earn more, they suddenly start to spend more, and that's what prevents them from properly saving.
I think that's why there's so much confusion, because you can point to a millennial who spends $1,200 on DoorDash. Not good. But you can also point to a millennial who's very financially conscious, making $80,000, and is drowning in debt, and is living with a roommate, and is a lawyer at 29 years old. That is not right. If someone got straight A's in school, straight A's in college, got a bachelor's, got a master's degree, and is 29 making $80,000 and can't even get their own apartment, let alone purchase a house or have financial stability. So that's where I think there's something broken in the system.
Even though households have become significantly wealthier, many consumer goods are also a lot more expensive. And at the same time, Americans are now largely on their own when it comes to things like insurance, retirement savings, healthcare. That makes it harder just across the board to feel financially secure. In some ways, Americans are even more financially vulnerable now. Even as prices have come up significantly, consumer spending hasn't really changed that much. And that leaves more Americans relying on things like credit cards to kind of make ends meet at the end of the month. With economists now forecasting a possible recession in the months or year ahead, there's a greater chance that many Americans won't be prepared for an economic shock.
There aren't so many people in the middle class. There's a big working class. Those are people who helped elect the president, who want stable jobs, who want rising wages, who want to be able to do things for their family and improve life for their kids that they don't feel they can do now. But those people haven't seen much respite.
The core kernel of wisdom in the avocado toast issue.
They're getting real serious on this avocado toast. I wasn't expecting such a long segment about avocado toast.
Is make choices about what really matters to you. You spend money on stuff that will be of value to you. Also, good advice is create a savings habit. Unfortunately, the way that ends up getting translated to people is you should set aside 6 months of earnings in case of an emergency. And most people are like, yeah, that's impossible. That's impossible.
So they've been talking about kind of like this spending or discretionary spending that could exist. I think some things that you should think about is like, don't necessarily worry about like the $100 expenses that you have. Again, I don't know if anybody's going crazy with avocado toast, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day out. But for the most part, if you're having an indulgence once in a while, it's not going to be that big of a deal. You should really be thinking about like $1,000 or $10,000 questions, or $100,000 questions, like where do you work? Where do you live? Do you rent? Do you have a roommate? Are you owning? Those types of things. That is probably going to be a much larger impact to your life, as well as like, do you have one car versus two cars, or did you buy the fanciest car you could, or did you get a used car? Like, those are things that are mostly going to be big portions. Obviously, some people do a lot of discretionary spending and it adds up, like avocado toast, plus you go to get a coffee, and then you go like on a mini shopping spree for whatever reason to just get a pick-me-up. And if you do that every day, it's obviously going to add up. That could turn into thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. But something they didn't touch on, especially for younger folks, is things like Klarna and Afterpay and that type of stuff, where folks are now kind of like nonchalantly borrowing against their future income, especially at a time where like job market isn't as great, is very dangerous. And I would definitely caution folks against it. You could end up in a scenario where you're sort of paying, basically saying my future self will pay for this, but your future self might not have a job or the means to be able to pay for that. And that can get you in a lot of trouble. Kind of going back to how they opened the segment with credit card and consumer debt and student loans, just general debt overall can be bad for you, especially if you take on too much of it. And so that's definitely something I would also caution against. That could add up a lot, especially since some credit cards can go to like 20 to 25% interest rates. This is where that's going to be huge. You can't get a raise of 25% most of the time. You can't get a return on investment of 25% in most cases, certainly not reliably. And so that's going to be a huge, huge pull and drag on your financial welfare. And you should be worried about those things. Not necessarily if you go and get an avocado toast like once a week or once a month. Obviously, you know your own spending, but I would caution against some of these other things as well.
It's a huge amount of money. And so what people then take from that is, I guess I can't save.
So I always encourage people, once you do get that promotion, just stay where you're at for a while and just accumulate money, even for just a year. Maybe buy yourself something nice, but just keep that money for a little while and just enjoy the freedom, because all of a sudden you're not as fearful at work because you got a little cushion.
This is good advice. I think another way I've heard this said is basically like start saving 50% of your raise, especially if you do it right away and you automate it. You can end up in a scenario where you still see an increase. So like, let's say your paycheck increases by $100 and you save 50 of those dollars. The other 50 you still see the increase on. You still have more income, and the other goes towards savings. And the longer you do this, even if you start at no savings at the beginning of your career, every raise, every promotion, every time you switch a job, if you save 50% of the increase, then you get closer and closer to like a 50% savings rate. Obviously, you might not ever make it to 50, but you could go from 0 to like 10% after a few years, just like more easily kind of making some cuts into your paycheck. So he's kind of phrasing it a different way of like, maybe spend your first year not having any lifestyle increase, which also could be good. But I think the 50% is definitely something I would recommend, just because it's easier to sustain it. Because if you are staring at your bank account and you're seeing 100% of that raise and you're not touching it, it's sort of going to be a temptation for you month after month. Whereas if you start saving it, like making investments into like your retirement account or investment somewhere or paying off debt, for instance, then like you don't just have it there sitting, kind of burning a hole in your pocket, waiting for you to go buy avocado toast, I guess.
There are more ways today to upskill than there have ever been before. I mean, there's online classes, certification programs, even, online degrees. So it is easier today to make yourself more competitive in the job market, which will help if you do feel like your job or job security isn't what it used to be.
There's a societal need here, and some of that is about embracing and understanding that if you are struggling financially, it is not your fault. People often feel a lot of shame and distress when their financial lives are not going smoothly. And yet a lot of what they're experiencing is not the result of anything that they have done or could have done differently. It is the result of choices we as a society are making. And can we make those choices in a way that will allow me to be financially stable and upwardly mobile?
I think that's a good call out. I don't think anyone necessarily should feel shame about their financial situation. Obviously, if you're getting avocado toast, breakfast, lunch, dinner out, then maybe you should feel shame. But for most Americans and most people, they are responsible. I think something that I know that gets called out is like sometimes people have a stigma against poorer folks and they think they're like wasting their money, etc. But actually, folks who have less money generally spend a lot more on necessities like groceries, home, transportation, childcare, etc. And they actually generally spend less on recreational or discretionary spending, or partake in any of those types of things. And so if you're one of those individuals, obviously, like, you know, you're in that situation and it's not necessarily your fault. There's things around it. Maybe you need to find the right opportunity. Maybe you need a time to make some progress. Maybe you just need a hand with taking care of your kids so you could do a new job interview or something. You might be 1 or 2 steps away from like making a noticeable difference. And I think something that's also useful to know, I think we hear information like the average millennial wealth or like the average income in America or things like that. And sometimes those numbers can seem very big. And something that could be helpful that I think people kind of lose context into is that we as Americans actually kind of like jump up and down within these wealth and income brackets. And so somebody who's at the 70th percentile of income one year, they might be the 30th percentile the next year. There's no guarantee that they're getting consistent income. It's not like you go to a higher income and then you're staying there forever. And the same thing works in the opposite, which is just because you're in a lower income now doesn't mean you're stuck there for life. And so I think it's almost inherently ingrained in the American experience that all of us are going to struggle for some portion of our adult lives and potentially elderly or childhood lives as well. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to struggle the entire time. I think just keep thinking about how you can improve your situation, ask people for help, find ways to progress. Even if you just make a very small step forward, these things will accumulate over time, and maybe like moving an inch will eventually get you a mile farther from where you are, and that could be all the difference that you need.
And then I also think the reality is that societal change is slow, and any one individual does have to make their financial life work as best they can in this moment. We're going to see people cohabitating with friends for longer and coming up with creative ways to share childcare across families, because that's what it's going to take to make it work. And actually, we're going to see, I think, some real benefits in community that could come out of that. So to look for the silver lining of, okay, I might not be able to be as independently financially stable, but what does that mean for the interconnections I can and should create with other people?
Thank you for watching. I'll see you around.